Hi folks, welcome to RJ Impact. Today we're going to be talking about a case of fraud that demonstrates both brazenness and incompetence on a scale equally as impressive as the values involved. It's a very clear demonstration of the lengths at which some people will go to exploit weaknesses in bureaucratic systems, particularly when the outcome is as lucrative as you'll see here. The number of people involved? Well, over 10,000 I claim. That's impossible, I hear you say. Well, listen on and I'll convince you otherwise. This is the moment police in the UK burst into a shop in the middle of London looking for the leaders of an organised group who committed the single biggest welfare state benefits fraud ever in the UK. A big question people are asking in the UK is how on earth this could possibly happen, and to give you some insight as to the opportunity that arose, if not the motivation, I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson. It might seem unrelated at first, but we're talking about a fraud committed in one European country by perhaps thousands of citizens of another European country. Now I'm going to stick my hand up here and say that whilst we know that thousands of people were involved, we don't at this time have much data on how many were actually participants actively, how many were coerced perhaps into committing the fraud, how many were unknowing participants even, and just as relevant, how many may not have even existed at all. After the recent court case on this, and we'll come back to that, I believe the legal system is currently focused on the recoveries of the proceeds of the crime and may not be actively pursuing individuals at this point in time anyway. So let's get to the history lesson in a roundabout way anyway. The Oxford English Dictionary notes that the term grocery store in American English is often used to mean supermarket as we would understand it in the UK. Now a grocery store in the UK will never be an Asda or a Tesco. Think Walmart's in the US as a comparison. The grocery stores as we know them in the UK are typically all pretty similar. They usually consist of a ground floor, a single room. They'll sell very similar products. There'll be vegetables and fruits, bread and eggs, crisps and chocolates, and a variety of tinned food. The kind of things you might say call staples. Oh, and archetypally, they will sell spirits, beers, wines and tobacco. Now, a single grocery store does not make a person extremely wealthy, but yes, if run well, it can be a very fine income. But with a single store, you're never going to get rich beyond the dreams of avarice anyway. I hawked around until I could find some examples of typical looking grocery stores, and I'm really using these as a segue into showing you this photo. The lady, who appears anyway to be blowing a kiss at the camera, is Galina Nikolova. We don't know who the gentleman standing beside her is. As you can see, she's standing behind the counter in what we would call a typical grocer shop, the one that the police were raiding, and I'll reveal now that this lady was considered one of the fraud's masterminds. So a deep breath. Britain, until its infamous Brexit, used to be a member of the EU, or European Union. It originally started as an economic collaboration in the early 60s, and it was called the Common Market. It aimed to reduce red tape and harmonise standards, etc. between Western European countries. All fine and dandy. There is a long and politically at least painful journey from those somewhat halcyon days up to the point of Britain leaving the EU, the infamous Brexit. For our story, I'm just going to focus on events that happened from the early to mid 2000s. And if you know your history, you'll remember that the USSR went from being exactly that to being Russia and other countries as the communist system collapsed in the late 90s, early 2000s, and Russia then became an independent state again in 1992. The disparity in wealth between the former communist countries and Western Europe saw those former communist states looking west and really seeking to join the EU. And between 2004 and 2007, the following ex-communist countries and Greece and Malta joined the EU. Let's just rewind and show an extract of that police raid again. There, you see it? Recognise any of those countries from the list of the EU countries joined in the mid-2000s? There you go, that's right, Bulgaria. That's what I wanted you to notice. So what's this quintessentially British grocer shop doing with the likes of Eastern European former communist countries on its banner? Well, as the citizens of these former Eastern European countries, the ex-communist countries, came west to embrace the opportunities that joining the EU had given them, they were followed not long by the shopkeepers willing to sell them those home foods that they couldn't get here and were no doubt missing. I actually remember that time when a host of shops started to appear, a lot of them with Eastern European signage on them, and it was actually quite fascinating to see a lot of tinned, packaged, bottled goods, most of which I didn't even recognise when the shops at least first started to appear. But why this influx? Well, from an individual's perspective, it is very simple economics. Even the least skilled jobs, the lowest paying jobs in the UK at the time would have been paying significantly more than they were probably likely to get in their own country. It was inevitable, really, that they were going to chase the new opportunity. There were actually quite high unemployment rates in the Eastern European ex-communist countries when Russia left as a result, so that created an additional pressure for people to look out elsewhere for work. I did a bit of digging just to see if my memory on all that was correct, and broadly it is. The Bulgarian economy itself actually did fairly well during the period, but coming from such a low base starting point, there was or is still an awful lot to catch up. Even today, their average wage is only about 25% of the average wage in the UK. Now, the key to the migration was the passing of a European-wide law on the freedom of movement, or several laws or acts, which meant that any capital goods or services, etc., can move from one country to another as a basic right. And importantly, in the Freedom of Movements Act, people are given the freedom of movement as a basic right too. And it wasn't just the UK. I mean, the situation is that there was a large migration of people out of those ex-communist countries to the wealthier countries in Europe, and there was no stopping them. In fact, if you find that you can quadruple your salary picking hops in Kent, England, versus labouring on a small holding in rural Bulgaria, I know what you're going to do. It's common sense. You're not a rocket scientist if you work out what's happened next. Yep. A large diaspora of Bulgarians migrated to the UK, Germany, France, etc., the bigger economies in the EU. So the scenario we have is that thousands of Bulgarians, lured by the promise of better opportunities, find themselves transported to the bustling streets of London. Their mission? To get a salary which would be unthinkable back home, or so you would think. Universal credit. Sounds amazing. If you fall on hard times, perhaps you lose your job, get an injury, can't afford your rentals, etc., then the UK provides ostensibly what is a safety net. It's one of those political hot potatoes, but if you do find yourself in difficulty, it is the case that the UK will provide some kind of benefit to support you during those difficult times. Like I said, it's very political, but the point is here, it exists. Yet another segue, and yes, I promise you all these disparate strands will in fact come together, and you'll see how shortly. In Bulgaria, there is a little town called Sliven. By Bulgarian standards, it's one of the larger, in fact the 8th largest city in the state. Although still small for a city by most standards, it's got about 120,000 people who live there. It sits in the sleepy foothills of the Balkan Mountains and known more for its clean air, mild winters and cool summers than anything else. It does look quite pretty, and there are some historic buildings and castles in the area for those wishing to explore. A couple of locals here apparently enjoying a lazy afternoon. This is Inspector Panayotov, a member of the Bulgarian police force. Now, I don't suppose there are many high-end criminal activities going on in this sleepy town. Its former industries have been declining, and factories that were there have fallen into disrepair. The crime has been driven by this gradual decline in the local economics in the direction you might think, and so ghettos and a burgeoning industry have evolved and grown over recent years. Other than this fairly gentle decline, and nothing much appears to happen in Sliven. Mr. Panayotov, however, did notice something was different. In a very small section of this small city known as the Roma area, after the Roma minority had settled there, something was afoot. What Mr. Panayotov had noticed was a transformation in the local Roma areas. A lot of the buildings, instead of following the gentle decline of the rest of the city, were being restored. Let me rephrase that. They were being transformed into large mansions, no less. And that's not all. There are apparently 30 plus casinos in Sliven, obviously a high cash-based business, and definitely out of line for the number of people in the city itself. Another thing struck him. He'd noticed a significant number of people appeared to be wandering around the streets in top-end designer clothing. There was apparently a sudden influx of cash into the area. High-end stores and restaurants were opening to take advantage of this increased wealth. Clearly something was afoot. Now, in his own words, I first became suspicious when I started to see the influx of money into Sliven. I wondered how these people had got such money. I received information from contacts that hundreds of people were receiving social benefits from the United Kingdom using the weaknesses in the British social system. When I received that information, I started to check myself and began my own investigation. I eventually concluded that we're talking £200 million a year from the UK. I gave the information to the British police and they launched their own investigation into the gang. There were currently 30 casinos in Sliven, and these casinos were mostly built by criminals who have a lot of money. The fraudsters were earning easy money and they spent the money easily, without any plans. They are living like barons. He went on to say, at the beginning, the British officers at the embassy said that's not possible, he said. Even our director was surprised at the scale of it all. So Mr. Panayotov had essentially told the British authorities, there's a fraud going on, these are the people involved, this is the amount of money being stolen, and they wouldn't take him seriously, at least at first. In the meantime, the gang were living the high life. Their social media posts paint a good picture. Stacks of money were seen in one video, and in another, someone is throwing £20 notes around like confetti, whilst someone else tries to pick it up. Dancing to a money waterfall appears to be the theme in this video. Clearly they were very successful in what they were doing. Mr. Panayotov had discovered what would later be identified as the UK's largest benefit fraud case. So what did the British authorities do? Well, for some unknown reason, it would be another 2 years before the raid that you saw earlier. I assume you're thinking now, well, no doubt when the Brits eventually did believe Mr. Panayotov, they went and made raids and arrests and a trial followed post-haste. Thereafter, not so. The UK authorities were not quick to act, and in fact arrests were not made for another 2 years. This seems to smack of incompetence. I'm going to hazard a guess that something was happening in those intervening 2 years, but I'm also pretty damn sure that several $1 million was siphoned from the UK Treasury at the same time via the fraud. I can't find out too much about the investigations that were going on during those intervening 2 years, but I know most of the scale and the identified funds were only unravelled after the arrests were made in these raids that we've been looking at. And that was only because the gang kept meticulous records, essentially keeping a database of activities on Excel on their cell phones. Yep, the full extent of their crimes meticulously laid out for anyone who wanted to follow the trail. So at the end of the raid that we saw earlier, police had made a number of arrests, including 5 people identified as the gang leaders, as seen here: Galina Nikolova, Stoyan Stoyanov, Sveta Turova, Goyanesh Ali, and Parizia Paneva. The fraud itself was audacious, to say the least. How they got away with it for so long is baffling, as the evidence for it all was around the UK benefit authorities all the time for them to see, if only someone had done a simple bit of due diligence. So let's set it out. A Bulgarian national would fly over to the UK and meet with the gang. Their objective was to create evidence that this national had actually been living in the UK for some time. If this were successful, then they'd work with the national to set up a claim for universal credit, or whatever made most sense to the gang. For example, it wasn't unheard of for otherwise non-pregnant women or a couple to acquire a couple of kids in the short time they were away from Bulgaria, on paper at least. Anyway, this is where the gang excelled. In fact, if they had applied themselves to legitimate business with the approach they took to this fraud, I've no doubt that they would have all been successful, and as a side benefit, they wouldn't be in prison. It was with precision and accuracy they went about their work. The Bulgarian nationals being ported in were needed as they had to maintain a large pipeline of regular news sources from whom they could tap benefits. By the end of the frauds, the locals in Bulgaria would actually pay the gang to get involved. But for the most part, they would get as many people as possible to go to the UK and would pay their airfare. They forged the Bulgarian IDs, and it wasn't unusual for one person to have registered multiple times. Letters to them from local doctors were simply just made up. Tenancy or rental agreements were often forged, which provided excellent demonstrations of evidence that they lived there. More evidence of residence? Well, stand in a street in front of one of the gang's buildings. They'll make sure the door is ajar behind you. Take a pic. Hey, presto, that's where you live. Forget picking hops or labouring for a job. For these people, their job just came via an employment record printed out in one of the 3 key addresses the gang used to commit and manage the fraud. Often, the Bulgarian would arrive, spend a day or two going through the processes required, and then fly right back to Bulgaria. Oh, and we can't have too many people in front of the same door now, can we? Well, that's no problem at all. We'll take a pic in front of any door, and with the magic of Photoshop, we'll open the door behind you. They may have paid the gang a few £100s or dollars for the opportunity, but would oftentimes get as much as £2,500 per month paid to them back in Bulgaria. A nice return for a pleasant trip to the UK. And this is where the gang really make their money, because after a couple of months, the £2,500 would then be diverted from the claimant to the gang, who controlled the bank accounts, etc. back in the UK. The scale was evidently vast. From materials gathered from 2 of the initial raids, in nooks and crannies all over Nikolova's property was cash under beds, behind fridges, etc. Yes, there was the obligatory trappings of wealth with goods, Rolex watches, jackets, etc., along with wads and wads of more cash. There was around $750,000 in sterling found during the raids, lying around in cash at various premises. So what did they do? Apparently the gang had grown from just 2 or 3 when the fraud started to about 4.5 years later, to become the 5 key players we know about. Although these made apparently 2 quasi-independent gangs, from what I can make out there was some hints at a falling out between them, but it's unclear how much of this did actually resolve itself. The gangs were acting more or less as one at the end. The key number that really demonstrated the scale to me was the fact that Nikolova had over 5,000 individuals over whom she was controlling benefit claims and diverting funds on her phone. In the other group, there were 6,000 individuals in their remit. As I mentioned up front, it's probably impossible to tell how many real people there were behind this number and how many were just fictitious. From what I've read, it's reasonable to consider that the real people is in the thousands, but probably not the 11,000 in total. Partly the reason that we don't have as much detail as you might expect is that the gang all pleaded guilty. The total they confessed to actually stealing in their pleas, although we will probably never know the real number, and which by all accounts must be much, much higher, was $53.5 million, or around $70 million. How do you manage such a large number of claims? After all, with 11,000 potential touch points with the UK authorities that could take place each month, there requires some logistics to the approach. Well, they managed it with a mixture of administration, process control, and a galvanised bucket or 2. A phone or a SIM for all the claimants helped. On these shelves, stacked with phones as you'll see, there were apparently thousands of additional SIMs lying around in bags, and even the UK authorities said they identified the same phone number was being used multiple times. Oh, and if the phones needed answering in a hurry, a transport system for them up and down the building was needed. This is where the bucket, less, came in very handy. The houses in which this administration took place were called the benefit factories, and there's no need to go to the local benefits office to pick up claim forms. We'll print out our own and keep a large stack for ourselves for our own convenience. And piles of these were duly found in the raids. The gang actually got brazen enough that some of the people benefiting from the scam had never even been to the UK. So the confessions and guilty pleas were for fraud and associated money laundering. The judge alluded to the so-called factories when he called it an industrial scale fraud in his summing up, and the sentence. Galina was given 8 years and her boyfriend a 4-year term. Ganesh Ali was given 7 years and 3 months, and the other 2 partners were given 3 years and 2 months and 3 years respectively. Taranova on the right here actually complained on their group WhatsApp chats about the amount of work she was having to do to keep up. My heart was bleeding when I read that. Apparently the chat group was mainly used to poke fun at the UK DWP, that's Department for Work and Pensions, in relation to the fraud. Conclusion on this? Well, prosecution services are going to chase the proceeds of the crime, but it's unclear how realistic this will be, as most of the money appears to have been moved overseas. The DWP Secretary of State talked about how this demonstrated their commitment to protecting the public purse and said, if you're committing benefit fraud and you're cheating the taxpayer, we will catch you. Personally, I think this totally misses the incompetence that exists in the organisation. How can the same phone number be used for multiple applicants? The same addresses be used and not noticed? How can large numbers of forged doctor and school letters be overlooked? How can 11,000 Bulgarians all be in London on hard times, claiming benefits? And the big embarrassment, how did a single detective with a common sense approach in asking relevant questions based in a foreign country at the far side of the EU be the one who actually identified the fraud in the first place? Why did it take them another 2 years before the raids took place? And personally, I hope there is a full and in-depth investigation into the lapses in security protocols in the UK DWP that allowed this to take place. In summary, totally embarrassing. Bye for now.